السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان يوم الدين أما بعد. So today inshallah we're having a bit of a transition, right? Because I'm trying to figure out how we're going to transition from the story of Bani Israel, kind of take that strand. So inshallah what I wanted to do is to pick up on the whole aspect where Musa alayhi salam and Harun had passed away, right? Remember, while Bani Israel were lost in Sinai, because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered them through Prophet Musa alayhi salam to enter into the to the sacred lands of Al Muqaddasa, they said, "Inna fiha qawman jabbarin." There is a group of people who are jabbarin, which means aggressive, aggressors. They were the Canaanites, Canaaniyin, and they were described as being giants, right? And so they didn't want to do that. They disobeyed Musa alayhi salam, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered them, or kind of punished them by making them be lost in Sinai, which means they're unable to get out of it for 40 years. And this was a chance for Musa alayhi salam to raise a new generation that is worthy of the support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Musa and Harun worked on raising that generation, and Harun had passed away first. And along who helped Musa alayhi salam was Yusha ibn Nun. Right? Yusha ibn Nun was among them. And he was when he was young, it was the person that Musa alayhi salam had taken him on the journey with, Al-Khadr. But some of the people, in some of the books of tafsir, they also mention, when Musa alayhi salam had ordered them to enter Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, and they argued, there's two individuals mentioned in the Quran. وَقَالَ رَجُلَانْ مِنَ الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ اللَّهَ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ ادخلوا عليهم الباب فإذا دخلتموه فإنكم غالبون. So there's two individuals from among Bani Israel. They said, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that that they fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed His bounties upon them, that these two individuals told Bani Israel, ادخلوا, enter, and if you enter, you'll be victorious. They mentioned that one of those individuals was Yusha ibn Nun, right? That one of those individuals was Yusha ibn Nun. So after the death of Musa alayhi salam, and so the way we're going to talk about this is we're going to talk about Yusha ibn Nun, because we need to figure out how they entered the sacred lands, and then what happened, and where does Dawood come in, right? So this is how we're going to transition into this, right? The whole period of entering Al-Muqaddasa, and then what happened. You're going to notice that Bani Israel has their their ups and their downs, and so what happened and how they transitioned into Dawood alayhi salam. Okay, so this is what we're going to do today, inshallah. So it's a bit of an introduction into Dawood alayhi salam, and then it's going to be followed by maybe 2 or 3 sessions about Dawood alayhi salam, and then about 2 or 3 sessions about Sulaiman alayhi salam. Okay, so we are at the area where Musa alayhi salam had passed away, and his whole purpose was to nurture a generation that was raised upon harsh conditions, right? They were not risen in a time of luxury. And there's subhanAllah, there's always an effect on the generation, whether it is raised in hardship or in luxury. A generation that's raised in hardship is more willing to work, right? More willing to be patient, to put in the work. A generation that's raised in luxury, how are they? Well, I wouldn't say lazy, Sheikh. They have interesting quotes, right? Work smart, not hard. Right. And we're going to talk about that, inshallah, subhanAllah, that the story over here lends itself, right? This whole thing about least effort, or whatever the case is, if you get a chance to talk about the test that Talut had placed upon his people, right? This is the whole thing about, taking the easy road versus the difficult road. Sometimes it's necessary, not always, but sometimes it's necessary. But we have to put in the work. We constantly have to put in the work. And a generation naturally that rose in luxury tends to not fight, right, as much as they should, perhaps, right? An example of that in history is Al-Andalus, right? Al-Andalus, when it was first started, when they conquered, the Andalus. Of course, it was a time of, Muslims were minority, and it was a hard time for everybody. They kind of developed an entire culture, an entire community, an entire civilization. However, when they got to the point where they were, pretty much they lived in luxury, and they started imitating the Europeans, this is when their downfall happened. This is when it happened, and this is when they were no longer able to repel the aggression of the Europeans when they started taking back Al-Andalus, right? The Spanish or the armies, when they came back, they couldn't fight them anymore, right? It was the complete loss. But this was the catalyst, right? This was the initial part of it that resulted in the end is how they were raised, right? And so it's important, Umar ibn Khattab, he said, "Ikhshawshinu." Umar ibn Khattab, when he was looking at the next generation, he said, "Ikhshawshinu." Khushuna means roughness, right? Ikhshawshinu, he's talking about to the males at least. Ikhshawshinu is become a bit more rougher, right? Be more responsible, be more in hardship a little bit. And this is why he would advise, for us to teach our generations, at least that generation at that time, when it was suitable, to teach them how to, archery, to teach them, riding horses, teach them swimming, because it would train them, right? These kind of sports required a bit more effort to follow up on things and so forth. But anyway, back to our story. So Musa was able to raise a generation that was in hardship. And it was not until Yusha ibn Nun afterwards that had the ability to take them into Bayt al-Maqdis, because this is when they were ready. Right? It was not the previous generation that would reject the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was not that previous generation that would refuse to submit to the commands of the Prophet and the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That generation was not worthy of the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it was that following generation that, that was that was, subhanAllah, was risen by the hands of Musa and Harun, and then Yusha ibn Nun took after that. But it also tells you that sometimes we plant the seed and we don't necessarily see the fruits of it. So Musa and Harun never saw the fruits of what they have sown. They did not cultivate it. It wasn't until Yusha ibn Nun, he's the one that was able to lead them and cultivate them. And so this teaches us that sometimes whatever we plant something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't have to see the fruit of it. We don't. Many of the companions at the time of the Prophet ﷺ never saw the fruit of their efforts. Even the Prophet ﷺ, he saw the beginning of the fruits, but not the completion of it. Not the complete, expansion of the Muslim ummah. It wasn't like that. And so our job is to make sure that we plant the seed and nurture it and water it. We don't have to reap the fruits of it. We could, if Allah gave us life, but we don't necessarily have to. This should never be our goal, right? To see the fruit of what we have seeded. And so the Prophet Yusha alayhi Nun, right? His story we're not going to take very long in the story because there's not much information about him. But the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned in a hadith what the story of Yusha ibn Nun. He did not specify him what it was, but later on. And so the hadith says that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ghaza nabiyyun min al-anbiya." So one of the prophets, Ghaza, which means he went on a military expedition. And he told his people, قال لقومه لا يتبعني رجل ملك بضع امرأة وهو يريد أن يبني بها. So he said, there shouldn't be a person following me on this trip, a person who was essentially newlywed and has not consummated his marriage, that he's still looking forward to consummate his marriage. And then he said, وَلَا أَحَدٌ بَنَى بُيُوتًا وَلَمْ يَرْفَعْ سُقُوفُهَا. And neither a person should follow me, a person who has built a house to reside in, and he hasn't yet completed the ceiling, which means that they're looking forward to live in that house. Right? They put a lot of effort and they still haven't gotten there yet. And then he said, وَلَا أَحَدٌ اشْتَرَى غَنَمًا أَوْ خَلِفَاتٍ وَهُوَ يَنْتَظِرُ وِلَادَهَا. Or a person who had bought a flock, right, of sheep or others, so he bought one or two, and they're starting now to produce, and he's waiting for that produce. So essentially he's waiting for that wealth. And so he said, none of these three people, or these three categories, follow me on this expedition. And so then he went out, and he approached the place where he wanted to, battle at the time of Asr, or close to it. And so then he ordered the sun, he said, إنك مأمورة وأنا مأمور. You are ordered and I am ordered. اللهم احبسها علينا. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, freeze it. Freeze the location of the sun upon us. فحبست حتى فتح الله عليه. And so it was frozen in that time frame until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him victorious, which means He allowed the conquest to happen. فجمع مع الغنائم. And so that person gathered that prophet gathered the spoils of war. فجاءت, referring to the fire, because at Bani Israel what they would do is they were not allowed to take the spoils of war. They would gather these spoils, and if it's accepted, a fire would come from the sky and burn all of it. However, the fire had come to take it, but it didn't. And so the Prophet said, "Inna fikum ghulula." There among you, there's somebody that has stolen from the spoils of the war. They're not allowed to take it or benefit from it. So he said, someone among you has taken it. It's stolen from it. And so, of course, nobody came forth. Right? We're talking about Bani Israel, or a person who has stolen. And so, nobody came forth. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, فَلْيُبَايِعْنِ مِنْ كُلِّ قَبِيلَةٍ رَجُلٍ. From every tribe, let one man give me a bay'ah, which means shake my hand, essentially. فَلَزِقَتْ يَدَ رَجُلٌ بِيَدِهِ. And so one of the hands of the tribesmen that was shaking his hand got stuck to the hand of that Prophet. And so he said, فِيكُمُ الْغَلُولِ. He said, in that tribe, there is the person that has stolen. فَلْيُبَايِعْنِ قَبِيلَتَكَ. Let an entire tribe shake my hand, the men. And so they did that. فَلَزِقَتْ يَدَ رَجُلَيْنِ أَوْ ثَلَاثَ بِيَدِهِ. So 2 or 3 men, the hands of 2 or 3 men stuck to the hand of the Prophet. And so he said, فِيكُمُ الْغُلُولِ. Within you, between you, as among you, is the one who has stolen. And so they brought out what they stole. And so they brought out a head, رَأْسُ بَقَرَةٍ مِنَ الذَّهَبِ, right? A head of a cow made out of gold. Sound familiar? Where did we hear this before? A calf of gold, right? And then also the whole story about the baqara, idbahu baqara, right? So anyway, so it's a golden head of a cow, and so they placed it among the spoils, and then the fire came and it took it. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, ثُمَّ أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ لَنَا الْغَنَائِمِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the spoils of war halal for us. رَأَى ضَعْفَنَا وَعَجْزَنَا فَأَحَلَّهَ لَنَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saw our weakness, right? ضَعْفَنَا وَعَجْزَنَا, and our incapability to refrain, and so He made it halal for us. So the over here, if you notice, a miracle happened over here, that the sun froze in its path, right? It didn't happen. And so this was a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, that had happened to this Prophet. But if you notice, this hadith does not mention the name of the Prophet. Does it mention the name of the Prophet? It doesn't. This was not mentioned until another hadith that was reported by Ahmed rahimahullah, where Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Inna ash-shamsa lam tuhbas ala basharin illa liyusha layali sara ila bayt al-maqdis." So he said that the Prophet said that the sun has never been held, refrained from progressing upon any human being except for Yusha ibn Nun, the nights that he had went out to enter Bayt al-Maqdis. And so this is how we know that this previous story we're talking about was for Yusha ibn Nun. But the question is, why did Yusha ibn Nun radiallahu anhu alayhi salam ask for the sun to be frozen? Why didn't they fight the next day? He wants to pray the salah in time? I think they might have been confusing that with the battle of the Khandaq with the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ, they missed a prayer because of the battle. But good guess though. Close, but not quite correct. No, but why did he tell it to stay? He could have just fought the next day, right? He must be what? So they're not going to win the next day? Huh? Not if you do the same thing? Perhaps, Wallah Alam. So the reason behind it was um, that this battle happened on a Friday. This battle happened on a Friday. So if the sun sets, it becomes the night of, what happens? They're not allowed to fight on a Saturday. So if they don't fight on a Saturday, and they can't fight on a Saturday, the enemies are able to probably overtake them. They won't be able to finish the job. And so this is why, Wallah Alam, as mentioned, in many books of tafsir, they kind of mentioned that, is that they wanted, like Yusha ibn Nun wanted to finish the entire, conquer Bayt al-Maqdis, right, and enter it on that Friday prior to Saturday coming in, so that everything will be settled and distributed. And so, alhamdulillah, he was able to enter Bayt al-Maqdis, and in fact, he even went further, and he went into Medina, Nablus itself, and he conquered it, and then he even expanded to Asham later on, right? And he hired governors and people to take care of those areas, and he distributed the lands in those entire area upon the tribes of Bani Israel, and he left the outskirts, right, both on the coasts. And it was mentioned also that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had allowed the river of the Jordanian river to run for Yusha ibn Nun, right? But one question from this hadith that's kind of interesting is why did he tell those three types of people not to come out with him on the battlefield? So he said a person who got married and hasn't consummated, a person that built a house that hasn't lived in it yet, kind of is waiting to live in it, and a third person, a person who has a cattle that's going to still reproduce and is waiting for that, for it to come out. Why did he order these three types of people not to come? Because they have a motive to go back? What does that do? So what's the problem with having something to go back to? You need to be able what? To stay with him on the battlefield, يعني ولا in the entire thing? Because, okay. Excellent. Focus, right? He needed people that were completely focused, that were not preoccupied by something else, right? Especially from worldly things. Because when you're going out on a battle like that, and I remember they were fighting people that were considered giants, right? The Canaanites, they were people that were more in number, and they had more weaponry. So it's just not larger in number, but larger also in military capability. And so they were fighting those kind of people. You need to be very focused. You need to be not bound down by worldly things or looking to it, because this perhaps would lead you a bit more to cowardness, right? Will lead to kind of a desire to want to live and to go back, right? No, when Allah orders them to go to fight, they all go fight, right? But He told them to stay behind because it has nothing to do with responsibility. الرجل الذي لم يبني بامرأته قلبه ملتفت إليها يا شيخ والذي ينتظر الزرع قلبه ملتفت إليه, right? This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَجَعَلْنَا إِنَّ مِنْ أَوْلَادِكُمْ وَأَزْوَاجِكُمْ فِتْنَةٌ لَكُمْ. Tabuk, غزوة Tabuk. Yeah, غزوة Tabuk. So غزوة Tabuk, when he went out, and this companion was honest, he's waiting for his crop to come out. He said, "Oh, come up next day, I'll reap it and I'll go." It didn't come out. He said, "Okay, next day. Okay, next day. Okay, next day." And he ended up not going. And the Prophet ﷺ was angry with him, right? Because of what happened. He was honest, which is good. He said, there's not a day I was more healthier than this day. There was not more a day that I was more prepared than this day, that I had wealth than this day. But what kept me back was I was waiting for the crops. And so the Prophet ﷺ did not forgive him for that. He said, stay aside until Allah rules, right? And so it becomes a distraction. right? And so essentially, perhaps what he wanted is he wanted somebody to that was clear-minded, that was focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did not have something that would distract them. Wallahu alam. طيب. And as I said, so Yusha ibn Nun remained, from almost 28 years ruling Bani Israel. And he had divided lands among the tribes of Bani Israel, and he left the outskirts of the coasts, and those were essentially meant for as a safe haven, right, for those who had sinned perhaps, or those that don't have a home and land, that they would stay on those parts. And Yusha ibn Nun had continued in his time to act upon the teachings of Musa alayhi salam and to call to the Torah. Now Yusha ibn Nun, Yusha ibn Nun alayhi salam, so he passed away in Bani Israel, obviously. And it mentioned that his age was about 120 years when he had died. So this was a short thing about Yusha ibn Nun, but there's a couple of lessons, right, that we can learn. One is that worldly mataa, right, worldly possessions, right, worldly possessions, whether it is a wife or children or property or whatever it is, could distract the servant from fulfilling their obligations. Could distract the servant from fulfilling obligations, but they can also distract them from righteous deeds, acts of worship, right? It can prevent them from going out in military expeditions when it's necessary. It can prevent them from, obviously because, out of mercy for the wife and children and so forth. It's kind of interesting, the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned this when he saw Hassan and Hussein, and they had come, and he was he had come down and he hugged them, and he said, "Inna al-walad mabkhalatul majbana," that the child is mabkhala, makes you stingy and makes you a coward, right? Because when you had no worries, no responsibilities, people tend to be braver. But when they start having a family, they start thinking about their family. It prevents them from being as brave as they used to. But also when they had money, they didn't really care, they would spend. But after they have a family, what do they think about? What do they think about when they have a family? How should I provide for my family, right? Not just that, but also after my death. So they tend to do what? Accumulate wealth. So that after they die, something would remain for their family, right? And so the Prophet mentioned that, but even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَعَلَمُوا إِنَّمَا أَمْوَالُكُمْ وَأَوْلَادُكُمْ فِتْنَةٌ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ عِنْدَهُ أَجْرٌ عَظِيمٌ, right? Know that your wealth and your children are a test. They're a test. And so we have to be careful we don't let our children and our property and our wealth be a distraction from what we're supposed to do, let alone be a reason that we disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one lesson we learned from that. And Yusha ibn Nun had made that distinction. The other thing we can learn from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of how He made concessions for us that were not in previous nations, such as the spoils of war. But it's also beneficial for us because those spoils of war can be taken to strengthen us further. Because usually in any battle, the enemy would take the spoils of war and keep it for themselves and use it to further strengthen themselves. But if we don't do that, what happens? We weaken ourselves, right? We weaken ourselves. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا غَنِمْتُمْ حَلَالًا طَيِّبًا, right? وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. And so eat from what you have, gained, acquired from the spoils of the battlefield, حَلَالًا طَيِّبًا, something that is a source of pure, that is sound. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ, and have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving. Now the other thing we can learn from this is how sometimes that the person who is of a higher virtuous status, his intention is never fulfilled for them, right? Sometimes because their own people let them down. So Musa alayhi salam, for example, Musa alayhi salam, hands down, is in a higher rank than Yusha ibn Nun. But he was unable to conquer Al-Quds, it wasn't because of the lack of his rank or the lack of his strength, but it's because his people let him down. Yusha ibn Nun, on the other hand, he was able to conquer Al-Quds because his people supported him. His people did not let him down, right? And so sometimes a person's victory or an ummah's victory or lack of victory happens because whether the people support the cause or not. That's really important, that we support the cause or not. And we don't have to go very, very far, right? The circumstances and the environment that we live in, the opinion of, the current climate of the view of changing of, the entire Israel and Palestine changed because the reality is now people are putting in the work. The Muslims, a lot of the Muslims, especially the younger generations, are putting in the work. They are carrying a message, right? They, they're helping the cause essentially to change the minds of individuals in different ways, and they're not letting it go, right? They're putting their life in danger. They're putting, their education in danger, sometimes in jobs in danger. You see, mashallah, young graduates, until this day, they insist to walk around the podium, either carrying a flag or a kufi, right? Even if they, some universities officially said no flags, there are no flags, you'd find that they hide it underneath their, their cloth. Once they get their degree, they take it out, right? Well, they're going to be in trouble later on, because what they have is not the real degree, by the way. I don't know, people who graduate from here, what you receive is not really your degree, right? It's just an empty thing. You get it later on. It gets mailed to you, right? And I don't know if that's planned on purpose or what, but essentially, these are individuals, this is what they do, right? But this is all about, do we support the cause or not? So, our victory is based on us putting in the work for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we don't, then there is no victory, right? And if you look at our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this also shows us the beauty of the Sahaba and the status of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, compared to the companions of Musa alayhi salam, right? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even when the companions were ready to give up their life for anything the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted, right? To the point that when it came to the battle of Badr, when they were out, they didn't expect a battle. And so the Ansar, the covenant between the Prophet and the Ansar, was that they would protect the Prophet in Medina, not outside. And so he's asking their opinion, right? And so they told the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, as if you are talking to us, because the Muhajirin were like, yeah, let's go, right? But the Prophet wanted the opinion of the Ansar, because they were the majority anyway. And they're the ones that had to give up more, because there was no deal between the Prophet that they would protect them outside of Medina. And so they told the Prophet, if you would cross the ocean with us, we would follow you, right? And we would never tell you like what Bani Israel told to Musa. They told him, اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا إنها هنا قاعدون. They told Musa, go you and your Lord and fight, we are staying here. But what we will say, go, right? اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا ونحن نقاتل معك, and we will come with you. Go and fight, and we will fight with you, right? And so this shows the difference, subhanallah, of why Islam, was able to achieve so much in so little time under the command of the Prophet ﷺ, is because it was the quality of the companions. It's that quality. It was never out of number. It is the quality of the individuals that the Prophet ﷺ raised. They deserve the support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this tells us, if we ever want to go back to how we were, we need to raise a generation of quality. Quantity doesn't matter if there's no quality. Of course, if there's quantity and quality, that's perfect. But to sacrifice quantity for quality, right? To sacrifice, to have quantity without that quality is not going to help us. As the Prophet ﷺ said, when the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that the nations would gather over you, right? Along you, similar to how they'll invite one another, similar to how people invite others to a meal. And so they asked the Prophet ﷺ, they said, أَمِنْ قِلَّةِ يَوْمِ إِذْ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. He said, is it because we are small in number, O Messenger of Allah? He said, no, not because of that. إِنَّكُمْ كَثِيرٌ وَلَكِنَّكُمْ كَغُثَاءِ السَّيْلِ. That you are plenty, large in number, but you are like غثاء السيل. غثاء السيل is the, you know, when there is a, what do they call it? A flood. You know the rubbish and the foam on the top, right? What is that? What happens to that? The substance is the water, right? The strength is the water. But that foam, right? That rubbish on the top, this is how we are. No substance, right? And subhanAllah, it is true, right? The reason where we are, the predicament that we are nowadays, is because the reality of that. If we look across the Muslim Ummah, and it's not meant to discourage, it's more to analyze realistically what's happening so we can be able to fix and move forward. The reality is the majority of the Ummah, they're distracted. They are distracted, right? Distracted by worldly things. We don't have the quality Muslim in large numbers as we had before. The majority of the Muslims are not of great quality. The majority of them are not abiding by the rules and regulations. They're so distracted. And it was kind of like, of course this is all planned, by the way. Like there's a plan to cause this in the first place. The least of it, I was kind of shocked. Like I have not been in Egypt in such a long time. And Sheikh, you're from Egypt. You can correct me if I'm wrong, right? And I happened to stumble upon, I think I went to my parents' apartment and it seemed like the cable was working. And I was looking through the cable channels, right? About 70% of the cable channels are music channels. Am I right or wrong, Sheikh? No, I'm talking about just majority are music channels. How many music channels do you need? Why so many, right? And of course, the remainder of it are between movies and a bunch of other stuff, which is what people would watch. And about maybe 4 or 5 channels are Islamic. But there is a plan for that. That was placed on purpose. Because I don't know any other Western country that has 70% of their channels as music channels. Right? I don't think it's the same thing here. I don't think it is. Right? Wallahu alam, I might be wrong, because I don't really go to search yet, but it's just my reflection of it. But why? It just makes no sense to me. Like, well, why is this happening in Muslim countries? Right? But anyway, this reflects that, the importance of we have to be careful. We need that substance, right? And we're going to see that also in our next story when it comes all the way until the, Dawood alayhi salam and entering once again. Now, that being said, so now we are at a point where Yusha, right? So now, Bani Israel, we can see they go through ups and downs. At the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, they were on a high. And then after that, they went on a low. And then after Musa alayhi salam, they went up. And then they went down. With Yusha alayhi salam, they went up again. Okay. Now, when they were in Bayt al-Maqdis, eventually what happened is that they went through another dip. Okay. Now, of course, they had kicked out the Canaanites, but the Canaanites are not going to remain there doing nothing. So there's always this battle back and forth between them, right? Until one of the leaders of the Canaanites, his name is Jalut, he was able to kick them back out of Bayt al-Maqdis. He was able to kick them back out of the Bayt al-Maqdis. Now, once this happened, right, this is where in Surah Al-Baqarah, in that time frame, perhaps Allah Alam, when they were kicked out of Bayt al-Maqdis and they had to be out of it and limited in certain areas, by that time Yusha ibn Nun had passed and another prophet had came and was in charge of them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not mention the name of that prophet, right? And this was mentioned in Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الْمَلَئِ مِنْ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ مِنْ بَعْدِ مُوسَى إِذْ قَالُوا لِنَبِيٍّ لَهُمْ إِبْعَثْ لَنَا مَلِكًا نُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Right? And so they told, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, have you not considered the assembly of the children of Bani Israel, the children of Israel, when they said to a messenger, to a Nabi lahum, a prophet of theirs, إِبْعَثْ لَنَا مَلِكًا, send for us a king so that we would fight for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So this is what they wanted, right? They wanted a king for them to fight for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu, once again, by the way, in some of the Israeliyat, they mention specific names, but Allah Alam, we don't know the name of that prophet. We just know that it was after Musa alayhi salam, and it was after Yusha ibn Nun. So it was that time period, right? So that prophet, alayhi salam, if you notice, they said, send us a king, which is kind of interesting, right? Why would they need a king if they have a prophet? Do you guys ever think about that? It's because at their time, there was a separation between a prophet and a king. So in Bani Israel, the prophet didn't have kingdomship at the same time until Dawood alayhi salam. Dawood alayhi salam was the first one from Bani Israel to combine prophethood and kingdomship. Prior to that, it was Musa alayhi salam who was a prophet, and the king was Fir'aun, right? And so they wanted a king. They asked that prophet to send them a king so that they would, under his rule, be able to move forward. So he would gather Bani Israel, because after Yusha ibn Nun and after the defeat of Jalut and so forth, they kind of spread. There was nothing kind of gathering them, combining them. So they wanted that back again. They wanted to be collected, to be one ummah again, and to kind of move forward. And so they asked that prophet, right, to give them a messenger, whether it is to give them a messenger or send them a king, either through a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or that prophet himself would just suggest a person who's potentially that would be a good king for them, right? Now, that prophet obviously knew the nature of Bani Israel, right? So why are they asking? What are they asking for a king? What do they want to do? نُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. We fight for the sake of Allah. Okay? So what do they want the king for? To fight, right? To go on military expedition. Is that something easy and simple? No, it's not. Okay? So he knows the nature of Bani Israel. He knows their instability. He knows how they change from one thing to another. He knows that they are they sometimes can heat up a little bit, but then soon off they will cool down, right? And so what did he say? He said, قَالَ هَلْ عَسَى إِن كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ أَلَّا تُقَاتِلُوا. Right? He said, so he asked, so this was a response. He didn't say, okay. He said, would you perhaps refrain from fighting if the fighting was prescribed upon you? Right? Like, what are you asking for? Are you going to fight? Are you really going to fight? Or are you just going to refrain from fighting? Right? And so he's saying essentially, I'm afraid if this becomes prescribed, you're not going to do it. It's as if he knows that this is just a moment of, as they say, hamas. Hamas is like what's a good translation for it? Zeal, I guess, right? Like a moment of zealotry, of moment of pride. Let's go back and we want to conquer our land and so forth. As if he knew that this would happen, and then it would change once the reality hits, once the order comes in and they realize, we have to do it, they'll change their mind. I don't know why, subhanAllah, there's an image of a video that came into my mind. There was a big dog and a small dog in a cage, okay? The small dog went outside of the cage and closed the door, started barking at the big one, right? But then the dog went out from the other side, the big one, and so then the little one just calmed down again, because now it's the reality. Now I'm facing the reality, right? And then when he was behind the cage again, he started barking, like huge bark. Like that small dog was like huge, rough, aggressive, right? But then when he came out again, the big dog, he quieted down. So I don't know why this image came into my mind. It's very easy to claim I can fight, I can do this stuff, but when reality sets in, what do you do, right? And so it seemed that he knew that, and so he mentioned that, right? So and subhanAllah, this is the nature of unfortunately, until this day, this exists even among the Muslims, right? We're very easy to kind of say big things, but when time comes for action, very few people make that commitment, right? طيب. And so they said in response, ما لنا ألا نقاتل في سبيل الله وقد أخرجنا من ديارنا وأبنائنا. Right? They said, why should we not fight for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we have been driven out from our homes and out from our children? This makes no sense. So what this over here, it tells that they do have, as they say, بواعث القتال, right? The reasons for them to fight. There is reason for them to fight. The reasons are in place, right? When you are exiled from your home, you want to fight back to gain your home, to defend it, right? Bayt al-Maqdis, right? That was prescribed from them. Now, I don't want anybody to clip this out and say, look, this belongs to Bani Israel. No, it does not belong to them, right? It becomes the Muslims of that time Their time is gone. The Muslims, this is their land, and when they're kicked out of it, this is why they're fighting for it. Similar to how when they were kicked out from it, they were fighting for it by the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Yeah, people do funny things with clipping videos, Shaykh. Anyway, and so they had they had the reason to fight, right? Is to fight for their children, to fight for their land. And so they understood that there is reasons for change. So the reasons for change are in place, but what is left is what they themselves, right, to perform the act. They themselves also to change. The causes of change are there. The only thing that remains is them to change. And this, by the way, is a sunnah. Right? All of us, even as a Muslim ummah, we have the reasons to change, but did we ourselves change? That is the question we have to ask ourselves. Right? Have we changed enough, right, so that we can move forward, or we're still in the process of that transitionary change, if at all in the first place? But I hope, inshallah, we are in the process of change. طيب. And so what happened was, فَلَمَّا كُتِبَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْقِتَالِ تَوَلَّوْا إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِّنْهُمْ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ بِالظَّالِمِينَ. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, when fighting was prescribed upon them, what did they do? تَوَلَّوْا إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِّنْهُمْ. They turned away except a little bit. Right? وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ بِالظَّالِمِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all knowing of the al-zalimin, the oppressors, right, or the transgressors. One interesting thing about this phrase over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He told us, by the way, what He did over here is He gave us the end result of the story. Usually you say the story and then you talk about the end, right? But here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it was prescribed, only little went out. This is referring to the story we're going to talk about. But Allah gave us the end of the conclusion in the first place, right? As if He's saying, that's it, it's done, right? And then He mentioned the story, which we're going to go into, right? That Talut was sent to them. Because maybe perhaps is to tell us the real state or the reality of the state that these individuals were living in, right? The reality is, because this is also their own actions and their own sins, what they have gained, is that they were people that will not put in the work. When they're ordered, they will turn away. Right? And so this is also a lesson for us, that we don't be not the same, but also should never be in every aspect of our regulation. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to do something, we do it. If He tells us don't do something, we don't do it. We abide by those orders from the smallest to the biggest order. And then, the story starts over here, where the Prophet tells them, "Inna Allah qad ba'atha lakum Taluta malika." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent you Talut as a king. Now over here, if you notice, He didn't say, "I think Talut should be a good person, I nominate Talut." No, this was an order that came from where? From who? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It means, is there any choice or option or choice, or is there any room? Is there any voting process, any suggestions? No. This is completely taken out of their hand, taken out of the hand of the Prophet. This is who's going to lead you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering you that He chose that this person is going to be the leader, and that is to shut down any form of dispute. Right? Is that what happened? No. They argued. Right? They argued because it's not who they expected. Talut was the books of tafsir and different things I mentioned in there. Of course, there's issues with authenticity, but from the way also their objection is, it was quite obvious that Talut was not from the elite class. Talut perhaps was just like a commoner that didn't have any sort of very noble lineage or any sort of wealth. And so what they did was they objected. But the cause of their objection, right, the reason they objected, they said they had an objection because they had a criteria of who's suitable to be our king. And the scales that they were using were completely corrupt, they're useless. And so they said, وَقَالُوا أَنَّ يَكُونَ لَهُ أو قال أن يكون له الملك علينا ولم يؤت سعة من الملك. Right? ولم يؤت سعة من الملك. No, actually no. قالوا أن يكون له الملك علينا ونحن أحق بالملك منه ولم يؤت سعة من المال. ولم يؤت سعة من المال. And so they said essentially, how can he be a king over us? أن له الملك ونحن أحق بالملك منه, and we're more worthy, we have more right of that kingship than him, and he has not been given any measure of wealth. Right? We're more deserving of being kings, and he doesn't have wealth. And so they used two criteria to decide who's suitable to lead, to be the king. One, it is lineage, nobility, and two, wealth. Now the question is, when you need a king for a battlefield, right? When he's facing the enemy, is he going to tell the enemy, submit, I'm a noble person? Does his nobility help him at all? Does your nobility help you on the battlefield? طيب. Is he going to go to the enemy and say, bow down to me, I am rich? Does that help? Does your richness do anything? طيب. Forget about being a king. Any leadership position requires certain qualities, right? If we even put a principal for a high school or any school, do they require nobility and wealth to do the good job? A CEO of a company, do they require nobility and wealth to do the good job? No, they don't, right? So what is this criteria then? Where did it come from? So this is really a corrupt criteria. So which means that it's a lesson for us. We have to understand how to correctly value people. When we put them in positions, we need to make sure that they have the qualification that they need to hold that position. Otherwise, we're betraying our trust. Like we're betraying the trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us in what we're doing. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the messenger corrected that idea, right? Corrected the idea. He said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ اصْطَفَاهُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَزَادَهُ بَسْطَةً فِي الْعِلْمِ وَالْجِسْمِ. So he corrected them. He said, that's not the correct criteria. What are you talking about? These really are more like worldly criteria. They're fluff. In the end, it's nothing. Your nobility does nothing, right? And your wealth does nothing really. It can buy you certain things, but it cannot make you fulfill the job or lead a community or anything else. Because when it comes down to, push comes to shove, when you really have to do the work, they don't do the work. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that their prophet said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen him and he has increased him. وَزَادَهُ. Increased him in what? In knowledge and body, strength. What is he going to do? He's going to fight, battle. The body is, and the strength is beneficial. But also knowledge is key in anything that you do, right? The knowledge of whether it is how to lead people, how to nurture people, how to, cultivate, right? Talent, how to strategies. All these require knowledge. Yusuf alayhi salam, when he told the king to make him the treasurer, what did he say? Inni alimun. Alimun what? جعلني خزائن الأرض إني عليم حفيظ. Right? So Yusuf alayhi salam, he said, Inni alimun hafiz. I am knowledgeable, and hafiz, which means trustworthy. That I have the strength and ability to be trustworthy. Same two things. Right? By meaning, when the daughter of Shu'aib advised her father to hire Musa, what did she say? Qawiyun Amin. Right? So strength over here comes again, and Amin is trustworthy. Right? Trustworthiness comes out of also knowledge. It's extension of it. So that's the criteria we're looking for, right? So if we ever want to put anybody in position, they need to have the knowledge to do it, right? The ability and power to execute whatever they need to execute, which means we're talking about personality-wise, the charisma, the strength in their and also trustworthiness, right? All these are qualities that are required. And so over here, their king pointed this out to them, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had picked them, those, Alim and Havi, they picked that out for them. And then he told them, right, because to shut down any sort of argument, he said, إِنَّ آيَةَ مُلْكِي أَنْ يَأْتِيكُمُ التَّابُوتُ أن يأتيكم التابوت فيه سكينة من ربكم وبقية مما ترك آل موسى وآل هارون تحمله ملائكة. Right? إن في ذلك لآيات لكم إن كنتم مؤمنين. He said that the sign, right? The sign, he said, is that it will come to you, right? So the sign or the assurance or the sign that he is in ayat al-mulki, the sign that of his kingdomship, that he is the chosen one, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send to you a tabut. A tabut is a chest. Okay? فيه سكينة من ربكم. In it is a more of an assurance, sakina, like طمأنينة from your Lord. وبقية مما ترك آل موسى وآل هارون. So in that chest there is a remnants of what was left behind from Musa and Harun. تحمله الملائكة, that the angels carry it. Right? That the angels carry it. So what is the story of this chest? Right? Like why did it have to be brought? What's the story of this chest? So the story of this chest, or like or the tabut, is that after the death of Musa alayhi salam and Harun alayhi salam, they kept some of their belongings. So the staff of Musa alayhi salam, some of the clothing of Musa, some of the clothing of Harun alayhi salam, but they also kept the original the Torah in there. And what they would do is that whenever they would go on a battlefield, they'd carry that with them. Right? And for them, this was like a sign of reassurance. And because of it, they would become victorious over their enemy. And so as long as it with them, they kind of felt a sense of a reassurance. Right? But what happened was, and so essentially because what they had with them, they would not feel fear, right? They were courageous and they would fight battles with immense courage. But what happened was, after the death of Yusha and after their fall a little bit and their fight between the Canaanites, Jalut, after their defeat, what he did was he was able to acquire and steal that from them. And so that chest was lost. Right? And so whenever they go in the battlefield without it, they never felt that they were reassured, that they were supported. And so over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet, their Prophet alayhi salam, is telling them that his sign is that the angels will bring that back to you. Right? And so the angels were carrying it, and so it's a clear sign. Right? And so as the Prophet was there, as Talut was there, and the angel descended with the tabut, with the chest, and so it was said, إِنَّ ذَلِكَ الْآيَةٌ لَكُمْ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. This is a sign for you if you were believers. طيب. وَخَرَجَ طَالُوتُ. Right? And so Talut then went out. Right? Went out to fight. فَلَمَّا فَصَلَ طَالُوتُ بِالْجُنُودِ. When Talut went forth with the soldiers. Now over here we're going to see there was several changes, several stages of, I want to call it filtration. Right? Filtration happening. The first was when they were collecting the army. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, what's going to happen? The majority of them are not going to go out. فَلَمَّا كُتِبَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْقِتَالُ. What happened? What happened? Did they all go out? No, what did they do? But most of them did not go out. So when Talut, first of all, was gathering the army, that first filtration happened is those that, rejected the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that went back on what they were saying. So essentially it's a sin. It's okay. You don't want those kind of people with you. Right? Those are not the people that are going to help on the battlefield. So those were secluded. Now came the second stage of filtration, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that Talut said that he is going to test them. Right? إِنَّ اللَّهَ مُبْتَلِيكُمْ بِنَهَرٍ فَمَنْ شَرِبَ مِنْهُ فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي وَمَنْ لَمْ يَطْعَمْهُ فَإِنَّهُ مِنِّي إِلَّا مَنِ اغْتَرَفَ غُرْفَةً بِيَدِهِ فَإِنَّهُ مِنْهُ فَشَرِبُوا مِنْهُ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And so over here, the literal translation of it, or literal meaning of it, or the interpretation of the tafsir of it, is that he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to test you with a river. And so whomever drinks from it is not from me. Right? Except those who don't drink from it, they're from me, or who had taken just a palm, ghurfa, like just one palm of it. So the scholars say that the test that they had was a test of fasting. They were to fast, not from everything. They were to fast from water. They would be able to eat, but they were not allowed to drink, right? Because this essentially was a test that would differentiate and segregate the believer from the non-believer, from the person who has the strength and resolve and the person who doesn't. Because if you're not going to be able to overcome the challenge and difficulty of not having water and being patient with it, how are you going to be able to be patient on a battlefield with a group of individuals who are stronger than you in number and in preparation, in weaponry? So essentially that's what it was. And so over here, that second test happened, and many of them failed, and only a few remained with Talut. Here comes the third test. Once they crossed, فَلَمَّا جَاوَزَ, as when they crossed with him, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first of all, He said, فَشَرِبُوا مِنْهُ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِنْهُم. The majority drank except a little. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَلَمَّا جَاوَزَهُ, right, هُوَ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مَعَهُ. Once they crossed that river, him, meaning Talut, and those who believed with him, قالوا لا طاقة لنا اليوم بجالوت وجنوده. They said, we have no power today, right, against Talut, against Jalut, who's Goliath, essentially in English, against Goliath, Jalut, and his soldiers. That was the third, right, filtration. Even though they're believers, right, even though they went through, but at the end, what did they say? They pretty much almost gave up. They said, we have no strength. Now the remaining ones, right, they said, قال الذين يظنون أنهم ملاقو ربهم كم من فئة قليلة غلبت فئة كثيرة بإذن الله. And so the ones that remained, and many, some of the commentators of the book of Tafsir said the ones that remained, that made that statement, were the ones that did not drink at all. Even though there was a concession to drink, but these people that stayed resolved, they took the harder way. Because sometimes it is better for the self to hold it accountable with strength. Right? Sometimes it's necessary. Right? Now I said I'm going to go back to that. This whole thing about being raised in what? Toughness, right? In hardship. They put themselves through that. Because how are you going to be able to withstand everything else if you're unable to do this? Right? So even they refused to take from that gulp of water. And it was mentioned, the scholars of Tafsir mentioned that Dawood alayhi salam was among those individuals. He was a soldier. Right? He took by that, that strength and resolve. And he was not among the people who took that engulfment of one palm of hand. And it would seem that those individuals that said, we have no strength against Jalut, but those individuals who stood firm, they said, they knew that they were gonna meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So they said, how many numbers? Kam min fi'ah, right? There's so many of them. Kam min fi'atin qalila. How many of a small company overcame a large company by strength? Did they beat them by strength? Obviously not. They're a small number. By preparation and advancement in weaponry? No. How did they beat them? Bi-idhnillah. With the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this tells us that victory really is in the hands of who? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not about your numbers. It's not about your military advancements in weaponry. It's about the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. Right? This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَعَدُّ لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ مِنْ قُوَّةٍ. Prepare for them what you're capable of with strength. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only orders with what we're capable of. It doesn't matter what it is. Throughout history, if you look at the battles of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions and throughout, did they ever defeat their opponents because they're larger in number? No, they were always small in number. Did they ever defeat them because they had more weaponry or advancement in weaponry? No, it seemed that the people they were facing were always more advanced in weaponry. Then how did they win? Allah, their iman, their strength. It's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this tells us, by the way, I'm going to bring this back to what's happening now. Right? Until now, did the occupied body, are they able to take Gaza? Isn't that kind of weird? I find that strange. Because who's remaining there? Like these are people that have nothing left, but they're still fighting. But they're doing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered them, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is still supporting them. That's all it requires, subhanAllah. Right? And it's a lesson for us. Syria, right? In the end, Bashar had more strength, more weaponry, more support from other people around him. But in the end, what happened to him? Right? The smaller number will overcome the larger number. The less strength in military might overcome the one greater. By who? By the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so those are the individuals that were allowed to have that victory. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَقَتَلَ دَاوُودَ. Actually, there's a before that. وَلَمَّا بَرَزُوا لجالوت وجنوده قالوا ربنا أفرغ علينا صبرا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. They made a beautiful dua, and so when they faced, like Jalut, Goliath, they said, "Oh Allah, أفرغ علينا صبرا, pour patience upon us." They didn't say give us patience. They said pour patience because they understood the level of what they are meeting requires immense amount of patience, and they're unable to do it without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala supporting them, and so they made that dua. وَثَبِّتْ أَقْدَامِنَا and hold, and plant our feet firm, and firmly plant our feet, right? So that they don't run back, they don't escape their advancement. And so in the end, فَهَزَمُوهُمْ بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ, they beat them by the permission of Allah Ta'ala. وَقَتَلَ دَاوُودَ جَالُوتَ, and it was Dawood that had killed Jalut, and this was the first time that Dawood has been introduced in the story. That's our gateway to Dawood alayhi salam, right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَآتَاهُ الْمُلْكَ وَالْحِكْمَ وَعَلَّمَهُ مِمَّا يَشَاءُ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Dawood kingdomship and hikmah. Hikmah over here, wisdom, is referring to prophethood. And this was the first time in Bani Israel that a prophet would combine kingdomship. And from then on, it continued to Sulaiman alayhi salam, and Allah alam who else came afterwards, right? And so this was the continuation of that. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm going to end this because it's very beautiful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ النَّاسِ وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ النَّاسَ بَعْضَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَفَسَدَتِ الْأَرْضِ. And if it wasn't for وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ النَّاسِ, if it wasn't for Allah checking some people by means of others, which means that He placed people to put others in check, what would happen? لَفَسَدَتِ الْأَرْضِ, that the earth would go into corruption. Does that make sense? It is those few that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts, Muslims, that keep others in check, that prevents corruption from spreading. That they would ordain what is good and forbid what is evil. They would call to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They would be the ones on the front line fighting for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They keep the others at bay. Even if momentarily they're victorious, they'll still prevent them from spreading a bit more. Once again, example, what's happening in Palestine is those few people that are preventing the occupiers from even moving further. They're unable to do it because they still are there. Right? Otherwise, corruption would spread. Wallahu alam. I went over time. I apologize. We have a few minutes, inshallah. You can grab your chai next for Isha, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Next week we'll start the story of Dawood alayhi salam, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Sorry? They went back. They were sent back to wherever they are. No, they actually after the conquest. No, everybody moved, Sheikh.